All right, so welcome to this episode. Today we're actually going to be talking with a pretty cool guy that I got the chance to meet today for the first time, which I'm excited by. He's someone that's been in and around financial services now for a couple of decades. He's been involved in technology and was in software and fintech before fintech was ever a word. And I think there was a quote from our conversations earlier today that kind of sums up his passion, his focus, and in some respects, his nerdly attention to specific details on compliance. So that might give you a little bit of a tip as to what this quote is, but it went along the lines of there's no silly questions when it comes to compliance. So since, for the last decade nearly, he's been helping licensees to get set up and then to go about managing their AFSLs within a compliance regime. And I invited him to come and have a chat with us today because it's a particularly important issue for Australian financial services. They're going through a huge change at the moment. There are so many advisors out there who are having to look for a new place to have a license, and a lot more that will be thinking about this in coming years. So the chance to sit down and say, hey, who should actually have an AFSL? What's the truth about it? What's the pros and cons? And let's talk it through with someone who does this all day long. So without further ado, I'm going to throw over to Keith Hockley. And before I do, I'm just going to say, if you want to reach out and actually have a chat to Keith, he usually only takes clients as referrals. So he's not here today to kind of drum up business or any of those things, just to have an honest chat about the stuff that you should be thinking about. That being said, if you do want to connect with him, then please feel free to shoot him an invite on LinkedIn. We'll have the details wherever you're checking out this particular recording. And you can also jump in and grab his email address. And I couldn't remember off the top of my head, so I'm just going to grab that one now. And I've lost it now. Keith, mate, can you jump in and tell everyone your email address? Sorry, mate, that was a bad fail on my part.
No, sure, Baz. Thank you. It's Keith, Keith, at LCS. That's L for Lima, C for Charlie, S for Sierra, .net.au. And that's the best way, just to drop us an email. And any questions, as you open with, there's no silly questions when it comes to compliance, especially within the AFSL licensing regime.
Now, I think it's actually pretty interesting because, we're going to have a whole lot of things to talk through today as well. But, meeting someone who, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend or anything when I call you a compliance nerd, but I think in some sense that's, that's actually what you are. But someone who's really passionate about the profession as well. And what we're trying to do here in this particular series is investigate and talk about the, Australian financial advice space post-Royal Commission. And so there's some big changes going on there. Now, before you do go ahead and email Keith, can you please just do us a favor and watch this whole video? Because if you actually get through this, we're going to really unpack some serious stuff here. And you get through this and you think to yourself, you know what? I actually think that running an AFSL, based on everything I've learned today, is the right way to go. Then I think that's the time when it would be appropriate to reach out and have a chat to Keith, because from today, I'm hoping that you'll be pretty well informed about the pros and cons, the costs, the risks, and all of those things. We're going to delve into that today. So, mate, I'm going to throw over to you now, Keith. Thanks a heap for coming and spending some time with us today. And I know when we first were talking about this, it kind of came up with having your self-managed license, or having your own self-managed licensee, or even all of the terminology that goes with this. So what is your own AFSL or my AFSL, and what's actually the definition of this? So maybe I'll throw over to you before we get into that.
Yeah, well, it is just that, your own AFSL license. But what we wanted to begin with, I think, Baz, was that there's a terminology people bandy around called self-licensing, and that definition needs to be defined. When I speak of self-licensing for this discussion, it's defined as an authorised rep who wants to get their own AFSL license with the assistance of a consultant. not do it themselves. Yeah, you can go and do it yourselves, and more power to you. If you mess up on the application, it'll be a traumatic experience, versus becoming self-licensed and having a consultant, whether it's myself or someone else, assist you along that journey is paramount. And that's what we're discussing here today.
Okay, so I think that's really interesting, and it's a really valid point. I always like to get to the fundamentals behind things, and the words that are used in any particular frame of reference can actually trigger you to have a particular focus or belief in what something is. It's not self-licensed as in you have to do it on your own, and I think that's really important, because the question of who should do it and what's the risk and how does it apply and is it easy and is it hard is really defined by whether you've got the right people helping you to do it, which is one of the reasons that, I invited you to come and have a chat to us today. So I think that's really, really interesting as well. Okay, so let's jump into it. And, one of the questions I had and I put to you, which was a point of view that I had, and you said to me when we were talking about it that, hey, Baz, that's not a question, that's a statement. I was actually making the statement to see, to pose it to you to see if you thought that along similar lines. And I'll just repeat it for everyone so that they've got some context on what we're talking about. And that was, it seems to me that a lot of advisors in Australia have been brainwashed into, now whether that's intentional or not, we're not kind of starting conspiracy theories here or anything, but have been brainwashed into this idea that having your own AFSL license is just really hard, it's really expensive, and it's really risky. So what was your input on that statement?
Well, we were a little bit more pointed, I think, when we said that certain groups have brainwashed their representatives into believing that self-licensing was too hard. And that's why I just wanted to frame what self-licensing was. And to go back onto that statement, there's also two parts to that. Self-licensing, in that once they get their AFSL license, we assist them run their license rather than, again, those guys doing it themselves. And we over the years have only ever helped one group get a license, then part company. That's just not our business model, because that's not doing anyone any justice, because then all of a sudden they've got to run this thing that they had no idea initially to do with. So yeah, I believe people have been brainwashed into the effect that, oh no, this is all too hard, I can't do it myself. And to an extent that's correct, where they get help. But to get your own license and run it is very doable and very possible. And it's just one of those things that we can do it in our sleep. It's not too hard, it's not too costly, and it can be done with the right help. A little bit like having other business consultants and accountants and other people doing various functions with any business that you endeavour on. This is just one of those items where anyone can do it if they are suitably qualified and have the business acumen and the drive. That's important, to go out there and have their own AFSL license. Leave it to the professionals to help them run it.
So I'm going to make a little disclaimer at the front here of our conversation, and that is that as we work through some of these questions that I wanted to unpack with our audience, at any point in time, I think quite a lot of people might actually be surprised by the questions of risk, cost, and time. And I know I certainly was as we were delving into this in a positive way. And so I just want to say to everyone that neither of us are here to paint a particular picture on which way you should go from a licensing point of view. And if it does sound a little rosy, at the end of our conversation, we're going to really focus in on the truths about who should be considering having their own license and at what point in time, and the things that will be positive in that respect versus, if you're the wrong person or in the wrong situation, having your own license may not be appropriate. So we will unpack that. And I just kind of wanted to let everyone know that. So let's jump into it. And we'll talk about the first question here, which is, how hard is it really to be self-licensed? Now, I wanted to delve into that and say, what does that question really mean from a financial advice, financial planning principles perspective? Because I think what it really means is, how much headspace and time is it going to take me to consider and to go through this process. And so there's kind of two elements when it comes to time. One is, how long does it take to actually get your license? I think we'll come to that second. But the first one is, how much effort is involved for a business owner or business owners when it comes to this question? Because I think most, or at least a lot of principals out there are just not going down this pathway. One, because they've been led to believe that it's incredibly difficult. But the question is, I'm so busy, I'm run off my feet, I'm struggling to do all the things I need to do anyway. So how much headspace and how much time would it take in the setting up a license process? Let's kind of unpack that.
So if we start at the beginning, which is someone who's already in the business, they're an authorised rep, they want to get their own AFSL license. Our business, we run a program where we basically drive the application process for them. Now, the principal and any of the responsible managers who are going to be part of that license, and there might be one, there might be two or more, they were going to have to devote probably 10 to 15 hours of their time to assist us in the information that only they are privy to and know, for us to be able to populate their documents and get their application together for them. So in my view, that's fairly painless. Yeah, I can do it in my sleep, but we give them all the tools, we give them the prompts. Anyone who's assisting in the right way will do that for them, so that it's still the client's information, it's still their application, but we've been able to frame it to meet ASIC's requirements, which is outlined in Regulatory Guides 1 through 3, on what has to be submitted for an analyst to assess the application and to get it through the process. The second step to that is, I think you're alluding to it, is what's involved once we've got our license application.
Okay, well, let's kind of delve into that. So I think that is actually pretty surprising, because a lot of people don't think about this, because in their heads, it's just too much time and effort. But in reality, for such a major part of your considerations for the future of your business, 10 to 15 hours is not actually a lot of time. Like you're talking a couple of days. That's pretty damn doable. And I think the other thing about this is the headspace issue. So if you had to think about it and understand everything and kind of build your homework and do all of that, sure, that's a huge amount of headspace involved. But when you're being guided through by the right people, then it's really a step-by-step process. And I think we're going to unpack this a lot when we get to talking about risk and, all of those other things as well. But I was certainly surprised by that. I think that's certainly very, very achievable. So yeah, let's kind of move into the second part of the equation. When it comes to running a license, so, if you are, and we'll talk about what responsible managers are and how that fits into the equation. I think that's also important for people to understand. But if you're running a license, and presumably the person running the license is in most cases also going to most likely be one of the responsible managers for the license, then how much time is that going to take them, out of their year, as far as what they have to think about doing an extra workload?
We brief the responsible managers that we're going to nominate. When I say we, the licensee applicant's going to nominate. And we, as you could probably tell, Baz, we take quite a lot of ownership in the role that we perform and take. So when we're talking about we, it's always the licensee applicant. We brief them on what's required. Sometimes they go through different documents so they understand their role. But if they've been an authorised rep, they're going to know and understand most of the obligations within their own license that they have to be as a responsible manager. There's certainly a quarterly obligation in terms of matters that need to be attended to. They can outsource some of those, they can do it internally, or they can do it themselves. And a lot of those are just matters through the compliance calendar, the monitoring and supervision. So again, we have a system and a process to make that relatively painless, where we're contracted or others are contracted to provide that services to the licensee. Now, their commitment in terms of time is they're in the business 24/7. They know what's going on. It's if something runs amiss, and I think what we haven't covered is there's no silly questions. Or maybe you did. There's no silly questions when it comes to
we did kind of delve into that, but feel free to say that as many times as you like.
So, licensees, directors, responsible managers, which are typically one and the same in this discussion, also the authorised reps. can come through any time with questions or comments on what about this, what about that. And that's a lot of our business's transfer of IP. And some of my colleagues say, you give away too much information. Well, if it makes the world a better place and these guys and girls are better informed, so be it. So the quarterly...
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to jump in there and stop you. Sorry to take you off on a tangent, but there's nothing we've said, today, we've had a bit of a chat today as well, that is more reflective of my philosophy in the world than perhaps that statement. I think as people who have advice in our DNA, and that's the two of us and the people who are tuning into this, I think, Mike, I would just encourage everyone to don't have a scarcity mentality. And the more value you can give to the world, the more it will come back. Don't get me wrong. I also believe in having great business systems at the same time. But look, sorry, mate, I love that statement. I think it's really true. And I just want to say I'm really grateful because I know we talked through this stuff before. I know that people are going to get a huge amount of information that isn't that accessible. If you're looking it up and you're doing your Google searches and all, and I know because I've tried, I think we're going to actually share a whole lot of stuff today, and that's immensely valuable. So thanks, mate. I just wanted to jump in there.
No, that's fine. So we believe, and I think it's testament from our clients that, yeah, we have made it simple because as you opened, our business is based on referrals, and people say, go and see Keith, and his team, they'll make it relatively easy for you. And what I mean by easy at this stage is running the compliance regime for them, with them in their AFSL license. Now, their first compliance meeting, the inaugural one as we call it, is the biggest. There's a lot to cover, there's a lot of material to go through. And then after that, it's relatively painless because we're doing a lot of the back office work for the client and their AFSL obligations on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. That's what they engage us to do. Take that out of the equation, yeah, the learning curve's like this. And most people don't have the time for that in reality.
Yeah, so I just kind of want to jump in there and make some input here because obviously all I do is speak to advice firm owners all day long, right? That's kind of my thing. So you're into compliance and I'm into talking to advisors. And so the reason that we're having this conversation is one, because multiple of the people that I work with said that I should talk to you. And I've spoken to lots of advisors who have gone down the AFSL pathway. And to be honest, a lot of them, their comments are, it was way easier than I thought. It's way less work than I thought. I can't believe I didn't do it years ago. And so I just kind of wanted to throw that out there from what my experience has been. That being said, as we'll get to later on, it's not the right move for certainly everyone. And I think people need to understand that. But from the point of view of actually making it work, the time commitment involved, I think the general overview would be that you get that back in other ways. So even though there's some requirement for you to invest some time to make sure that you're meeting your reporting guidelines, etc., if you're working with the right people, then most of that will be taken care of. And by the way, and I'm not trying to steal from our conversation later on, but by the way, it's actually going to be incredibly cost effective by comparison to most other options in a whole lot of scenarios, not all of them. Even though you're paying someone else to help you with this process. So I think that's really interesting. So now let's kind of get a little bit specific here about the time to set up, because I think this is really important. Now, part of the reason that sparked this conversation today is I wanted to delve into this issue of licensing and decision-making. And I put a call out via email, just the other day about, hey, can we please get some input from people on what decisions they're making, how are they going about doing it, and let's kind of open up the conversation. And the reason for that is we've had Magnitude and the Westpac brands, and we've got Aon just the other week come out and say that they're closing down their external AFSL. So we've got all of these advisors that are now having to find a new home. Now, there's some time limits on that, and I think we need to talk about how long it actually takes to set up a license. And I also want to say that I think there's going to be a few thousand other advisors that will be surprised by the fact that they may still yet be forced to change licensees. I think we've still got a whole bunch of that coming over the next 18 months. That's my slightly, or I should say very informed hunch. So without kind of giving too much else away there. So I think that's really important for us to consider. So if you're in that zone now, I think listening to this content is pretty important, because it's not something you can just, click your fingers and you've got your own license. So let's talk through that. How long does it take? And I know there's going to be variables on a lot of things, and part of my job today is to squeeze Keith a little bit on, I know it's hard for you to, but what would it really look like for most people? So I apologize in advance for doing that. But give us an idea on that.
That's fine. So once someone's engaged, and engage is everyone's committed to the process, one of the major things is, believe it or not, police clearance is coming back. They can take 2 to 3 to 4 weeks if your name's, let's say, John Smith, Citizen Smith, because anyone who's got a criminal record named Smith and you've got that same last name, it goes off for manual checking. And we're often waiting for police clearances, of all things, to come back to be able to lodge an application. So therefore, typically, for what I call generic, and that is by no means derogative, normal financial planning firm businesses that have a clear, concise business model, they haven't got exotic derivatives and FX and wanting to issue financial products. Those license applications take anywhere between 3 and 6 weeks to put together. I can guarantee you, when we engage with a client and commit to them, and we have capacity restrictions, obviously, so we will under promise and over deliver. We won't bite off and say something to a client, we can do that by next week. But we know we can't. It's going to be 2 weeks away. We are typically always waiting for the client to revert back to us for information. They've got to scrape off their qualifications. They've got to pull out this. They've got to apply for their police clearance, and it's got to come back. We're ready to go with all the documentation. And that can be anywhere between 3 to 6 weeks, depending on how quick they revert. Once that's done, we then lodge with ASIC. Then the waiting game starts, unfortunately, because of their workflows. Same situation. They don't know whether there's 10 applications coming in the door a day or 1,000. Well, in some cases, hundreds, especially when you have a dealer group who says, sorry guys, you've got to find a new home in 3 or 4 weeks. That's really problematic for everyone. Okay,
so 3 to 6 weeks is your typical turnaround time for people who are committed to actually getting it together and making the ASIC submission happen. And then what would be a typical turnaround time for ASIC from that point on getting back to you? Now, before I let you answer, I'm going to have a bit of a chuckle, because, remember that most of the people tuning in and listening to this already are advice professionals and operate in that space. And I'm sure if you ask them the reverse question, they'd also be saying that a lot of their time when they're first taking on a client is waiting for the client to come back to them, with the things they need from the client. So I think the irony there is something we shouldn't necessarily let go past. So what would be your average turnaround time for, and let's use some language that comes from advice that I'm familiar with. So clean skin, right? So it's relatively straightforward. There's not kind of too many complexities. You've kind of got it nailed down up front. What would you typically expect to see as a wait time from ASIC's point of view?
Well, that's governed by ASIC, and at the moment their published wait times are typically 150 days. That is, they come out with I think it's half-yearly reports. We've had 85% turnaround success completion rate within 150 days, and then we've had so many percent done in 180 days and so on. My experience in the current environment has been between 4 to 6 months for the ASIC to look at it, assess it, make requisitions, and make a decision on whether they're going to grant an AFSL or not. Now, we haven't got too many situations where we've ever had a point where they haven't granted the AFSL, because it's pointless lodging it if we know it's not going to stand up. It's just wasting everyone's time. So the lead time, at the moment, the last couple we've done, they've been very well prepared, very clean, good applicants. They've taken 4 months from the day they went in until ASIC was, in inverted commas, minded to grant an AFSL. And that minded to grant, basically then there's a few things that you have to get in order. Obviously, they're not going to issue the AFSL in the retail space until PI insurance is in place. And we have done a lot of work to ensure that the PI is ready to go. So in our firm, when ASIC's minded to grant the AFSL license, we got it in front of them the next day, the documents they need to, there's no delays in them issuing the license. And typically they get it done. Sometimes the analyst will get it done the same day, depending on what they've got on their plate. Other days, it might be 2 or 3 days later that AFSL is issued. So then we've got an AFSL that's issued, and we've got a corporate authorised rep that's still working under another licence in a lot of cases, because rarely do they sit on their hands while this process goes. But people need to be aware that it can take, especially if you get a bulk of applications come in when the dealer group either fails or gives everyone their marching orders, you could have 9 months waiting time if it hits the ground, because ASIC aren't necessarily going to put on another half dozen staff to deal with those applications. They're going to work within their existing resources, and unfortunately, it's just going to take a little bit longer.
Okay, I think that's important that everyone understand that, whenever you're planning business strategy, you need to look and plan as best you can within a range. And that's kind of the conversation we're having now. So if I was looking at that and thinking about this, I'd want to make sure that I'm not expecting this to happen in less than 10 months. So, that may be the extreme outside, but things happen, right? And it could get busier, and other stuff can happen. As you said, I could be right, and maybe there's more advisors. Maybe we get this in front of a couple of thousand advisors, and a bunch of them decide, hey, you know what? This may not be so bad after all. So just understand that there is a time restriction. And I think this is really important. So, if we have a look at, I think, just a couple of examples, Magnitude and Aon, from my understanding, I think both of them have till September as far as their deadline to move licensee goes. So it's not a huge amount of time, and it's certainly not using that as an example where you would be making your plan A, I'm going to get my license. And we talked about this a little bit earlier before we kind of jumped on to do this with everyone else, that in a lot of cases you may need to help them with an interim step. And, we talked about some examples of, the fast closure of Dover that happened last year. And so advisors may have been in the position of going, you know what, I need to be doing this for myself. I'm going to go down that pathway, but I have to operate in between. So it may well be that you need to consider having a transitional step, even if you are looking at setting up your own license. What's your thoughts on that, Keith?
For those that have been advised and the licensees that you mentioned and the timeframes they're given, that's going to be very tight for anyone to actually be issued with an AFSL between now and then. So whilst it might be plan A to get an AFSL license of your own, you have to have a plan B on where you're going to go and reside if it doesn't come through in time. So it's a two-step process in that regard. And unfortunately, it is what it is. The good old days of when I first started doing this, we would have licenses through in 3 or 4 weeks. No joke. Lodged, and here's your license, because as it weren't overwhelmed with work. And so this forward planning is we do it when I say we, advisors do it, and I'm a qualified advisor. We do it for our clients in terms of planning and scheduling and working it through, and we have to do it in our own businesses. So you're spot on with that, Baz, on working through what you're going to do and the milestones, and actively working towards it. Because my experience has been, which has been clients' experience, is these little life events pop up at the most inconvenient time, i.e. a Dover. That was, however that was generated, all of a sudden put a lot of guys in a difficult position to have to find a home. And I think it was inside 4 weeks. It was like 3.5 weeks. And that was really tough. Then they feel like they're being pressured. They feel like they're making hasty decisions. They've got to go and find a dealer group. It's not ideal, just so they can keep operating. And we talked earlier, when was the best time to do all this? It was always yesterday, last week, last year.
Yeah, when was the best time to engage a financial advisor? Like when you turned 18. But I mean, it's the same kind of analogy, right? When was the best time to, to get someone like Baz to help you go through your business and increase your EBIT? Well, when you started, it's one of those funny things, but it's absolutely true. And that leads me to a thought that I'm having that I think might be worth kind of asking you about. And that is, what about the scenario where you go, you know what? I don't know exactly what I'm going to be doing, right? And I don't know when I'm going to have my own license, but I'm going to go through the process of setting this up. So what's your consideration then for basically getting your license and sticking it in the drawer, so to speak, and maybe doing that for a 6 or 12-month period? Is that viable? How complex is that to do? Is that something that you've seen people do in the past?
Well, I wouldn't put it on the application. We're going to put it in the drawer.
No, I get that.
What I would do is I would advise people that if this is something you're going to do, bite the bullet, make the financial commitment and do it. And whilst it's in progress, I have seen 9 times out of 10, those persons' life change in terms of, oh, we could do this, we could do that. We've been telling people we're going to get our own AFSL because you are then the main man or main girl. You are the licensee. Everyone wants to deal with you, from intermediaries through to referrals to business coaches, whatever, because they're dealing with the licensee, and their world literally changes for the better. Now, I've never had someone who's got to the end of the process where ASIC's minded to grant them a license and they're like, oh, crikey's that thing. Geez, it could have been another 6 months. They're, oh, thank goodness, we are so ready. And these are the very folk who are like, well, when it comes through, we'll then do this, we'll do that. They're on it. They want to giddy up and get going. So,
okay, so let me perhaps reframe the question then. So because you don't know how long exactly it's going to take to get to the ASIC's minded to give you a license, I quite like that phraseology. So therefore you may have not kind of pulled the pin on speaking to your existing licensee and saying, hey, I'm giving you notice. And more than that, you may want to take some time to prep for how you're going to communicate with clients, make sure that you've got all of your transitional plans in place. So my point is it okay for you to have your license set up, not be operating necessarily under it, and take a few months to build the plan? Is there any particular risks or concerns that people may have if that were the case?
No, the way we advise clients and the structure we advise them to implement allows them to do that. They will incur ongoing costs from the day their license is issued, though. So that's something that needs to be borne, to considered. And as it get it, that you can't just change gears overnight. The speed at which you'll move from your dealer group to your own AFSL will be governed by your corporate authorised rep agreement. Some agreements have 30 days notice, some have 90 or longer, and that needs to be borne into consideration. But in answer to your question, yeah, you can park it. We still have to maintain it. We still have to meet our...
I understand that. Yeah. Okay. That's good. So park it is maybe a better analogy than putting it in the drawer that I used before.
Get out until the licensee gets their act together and then actually, right, this is the day that we want the go date. A lot of the transfer, Baz, is dictated and directed now by the old licensee, their outgoing licensee. And some of the dealer groups are putting very, in my opinion, erroneous obligations on advisors that actually aren't in their corporate authorised rep agreement before they will release them. And they do actually have to let you go, per se, to go across to your own license. So you need to maintain an amicable relationship. Woe to the person who gets very hot-headed and pig-headed about it, because their old dealer group could cause them a bit of grief when they go across to their new licensee. But we've got chaps who have sat on it for 3 days and others who have sat on it for 6 months before they've moved across, and actually longer in some cases for various reasons.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that from a strategic planning point of view, it allows, as a business owner, I'm trying to think of it through, our listeners and our viewers' shoes. Well, I don't know exactly how long the timing is going to work. I think this is what I want to do. So I'll put my application in now, and then depending on timing, I can work out my plans, and you can have a kind of a stepped approach. And I kind of like that from a strategic perspective. So we've delved into the how hard is it to get your license in the first place. Well, I think there's another element that a lot of people will be very curious about when it comes to the question of how hard is it, and that is how expensive is it in, you know, most scenarios. And again, I understand that there's always going to be, you know, a range of circumstances. But what's the cost like in most cases for someone to get their license up and running in the first place?
Well, obviously there's lodgement fees and various setup fees. And we workshop with people, basis their situation, how many responsible managers that they propose. It might be a sole RM, it might be 2 or 3 RMs, because the more RMs there are, the better. However, that's more paperwork and documentation that has to be collated and stories that have to be written. It's called a B1 table of organisational competence of what the RM as an advisor has done and their experience in advice and dealing spaces, and put that together. But typically we advise people to budget between $15,000 and $20,000 for the application preparation and lodgement costs. Reason the variable is different matters arise. There might be different requisitions from ASIC along the way. There might be 2 RMs that all of a sudden are creating a whole host of complications that just get swallowed up in time costs in dealing with it, that are unknowns at the time when you're sitting down working through with someone to actually prepare a budget for their license application. But the important point that I want to make here is it's a capital expense. Get over it, park it, move on, then consider what's it going to cost to run your AFSL, because that's the apples for apples comparison with what it's costing them, not only in monetary terms, but in risk terms of being an AR of an existing licensee.
Okay, so we'll jump into those because, you know, we've got some really, really, really important points all kind of jammed up there together. And so I think the first commentary that I would make on that is, I know you think that's a big variable, but when it comes to dealing with any form of, you know, legal structure, that's actually a pretty low variable range. You know, I've certainly done a lot of business ventures in my time where it's like, well, depending on how this goes, it might cost me $5,000 or it might end up costing me $50,000. Now that's a big variable. So in most cases, you're looking at saying budget between 15 and 20,000, and part of that will be complexity and how many responsible managers, et cetera, that you have. And before we go into any of those other issues, what I wanted to do now was actually talk through this thing about, well, what is a responsible manager? And let's just kind of pretend that I don't, you know what an RM is. So what is it? What does it mean? So we kind of understand having your own license. And if you're tuning into this, you understand having a proper authority in AR. So what's an RM? What does that position mean?
So when FSR was set up back in the early 2000s, ASIC wanted people who had the organisational capacity and skills for the authorisations of the licensee. In a nutshell, the RM is there to oversee the organisational competencies of the AFSL and its licence authorisations, be it derivatives, well, not in most people's realm, but be it superannuation, securities, life risk products, deposit and payment products, margin lending as an example. And they are there with the organisational expertise to be able to advise, let's assume a director who's not in financial services, what you can and can't do and how you do it. In our world, and what we're proposing here is the ARs, the people who are the authorised reps, it typically will be the responsible managers moving forward. Yes, they need to understand a little bit of the operations of the Corps Act and the regulatory guides around the operation of an AFSL licence. And that's where some of these variable costs on startup come into it. Some of them may need to undertake a specialist course that's not big and erroneous, but it gives them a heads up on those obligations. We have a worksheet that we provide clients on the inevitable question, well, I want so-and-so to be an RM, or I've never been one. What do I have to do? And that worksheet just covers off on their roles and responsibilities. It's published in ASIC regulatory guides as well, what those different tasks and functions are within the licensee. But typically, the licensees that we're discussing, Baz here, the director, the responsible manager, and the advisor are more than likely one and the same person. But there may be others as well.
Okay, and I think in most cases for the principal of the business, and if they're the kind of also the senior advisor, which is the most common business framework that we see, then yeah, that's probably very likely the case. But I do want to just kind of unpack the risk part of this, because I also think there's maybe some misconception about, being an RM and that being a much more heightened position of risk versus being a director of a corporate, authorized rep anyway, or just being a director of a corporation, or being an authorized representative of one. And how do those roles compare? Now, I'm kind of going to jump in there and summarize this because we had a chance to, chat about this before getting started. And you can kind of feel free to correct me if I've got any of this out of whack, but it seems to me that from a risk point of view, well, what happens if something goes wrong with the license? What does it mean as the responsible manager? Now, I'm not talking about if you're the responsible manager and the director of the business and the AR that was giving, advice that might have had some problems. I mean, just the role of the RM. And really, it's, as we talked about, it's a reputational risk one. So if something goes wrong, then perhaps that can, be something that comes back on your reputation. And certainly in terms of what actual cost or consequence could that may mean for the RM role, it's really mostly just the fact that they might not be able to take on another responsible manager role in the future if that were the case. So overall, as far as actual risk goes for that role, it's very low compared to the phenomenal risk that you take on in just being the authorized rep in the first place.
Let me be an RM any day over being an authorized rep or a director of a company. In terms of the risk, you've nailed it perfectly there, Baz, in terms of that role and responsibility. It's a very important role, don't get me wrong, but the director carries a lot more risk under the Corporations Act, and an authorised rep under the Corps Act and various regulations as an advisor. You just overlay the best interest duty and the fee for no service obligations and all of these acronyms that are cropping up now. Don't be scared of being an RM. That's the least of your worries in terms of what we do in the advice space in AFSL licensing. It's a very important role, don't underestimate it, but it's not one of those things to be frightened of moving forward.
Now, I think this is really important as we move into one of the main things that you need to think about in having your own license, and that is that it's probably in most scenarios a good idea, if possible, to have more than one responsible manager.
Correct.
And part of the reason for that is because what might ASIC say if there's only one person that actually has the knowledge and capability to represent that advice framework?
So what will happen there is the key person risk will come into it, and ASIC will put a key person obligation on the license conditions if there's only one responsible manager, or if there's two responsible managers and one of them doesn't have all of the competencies of the other, the one with the broader competencies, authorizations, and I refer to things, say, like margin lending. If one of them doesn't have margin lending, there will be a key person clause put on the guy or girl who has margin lending. Then in the event of something happening to that person, you've got 5 days to tell ASIC what you're going to do to rectify it, basically. And indeed, then you have to vary the license, which is a costly process, time and monetary, to vary a license. So if you can avoid what's called a key person clause on the license, you try and do so when you apply for the AFSL application, first and foremost.
Okay, so I think that's a really interesting point, because there's going to be a whole range of different businesses where this, idea of being self-licensed, it's appropriate, right? And if we just use a couple of examples, it could be, well, first of all, it could be the single operator who's the only advisor and the only AR at the moment, and then they maybe have an admin and a client service team underneath them. And in that case, they're going to, unless they bring in someone externally, and by the way, that is an option. You can bring in external parties. But even then, it still doesn't mean that having your own license isn't worthwhile. It just adds a little bit of extra factor to take into account. So it's still viable for someone in that scenario, and there are ways to solve it. Then we move into the next one, which is, I think, where I'm going to bring this all to a head, because this is very common, where you may have the principal of the business, and they have another authorized rep in the business who's also operating, but as an employee. Okay. And in that scenario, you can ask that employee to also be a responsible manager for the business. And so they're not necessarily taking on the directorship. If they already have an authorized rep, well, that's a whole different risk equation anyway for them. And it allows you that flexibility to do that. And so I just kind of wanted to bring that up so people understood. And then the third equation would be, that I see as being the three most common scenarios, would be a partner or principal firm, in which case it's more than likely that, multiple of those people are going to be responsible managers. But let's say, I'm just thinking about an accounting / advisory firm that I was talking to this week. They've got 4 partners, 4 principals. They all operate in both sectors of the advice space. And it may well be in their particular scenario that 2 of them have the responsible manager position. It doesn't have to be all 4.
That's correct. And I would always rather line up more RMs on the license and less directors than the other way around. Yeah. Share the love around. Forgive me, but accountants are the worst ones for all wanting to be directors. Get off of there. Why do you all want to be at risk? But RMs, let's get the RMs on there. So you're a director this year, you're a director next year, and you rotate around that role. But collectively as RMs, you have a license that doesn't have any key person clauses. One RM wants to move out, you move another one in who's duly authorised and competent to do so. Happy days. It's a good outcome. And it's in the big scheme of things, it's not a big issue. And you alluded earlier to employers. That's for a long-term employee, that's also a benefit. And especially if there's some succession planning in mind, it just makes common sense to remove the key person clause off the AFSL licensee, so that in the event that dad or uncle or the older guy or girl wants to move out of the business, we don't have to vary the license to remove them off the license authorizations because they were never there to start with as a key person, by way of example.
Yeah, I think that's really important to factor. So we've kind of covered that, the range of scenarios, and obviously getting the right input on what your decisions are as far as RMs go is pretty important. Okay, so I guess the next step is, well, all right, we talked through how hard it is to do. We talked about the cost to set it up. And I think a lot of people will be surprised by all of those scenarios in the positive. We've talked a little bit about the time it takes to manage it ongoing. And certainly, as I said, anecdotally, from a lot of the people I've talked to, they're in fact, I don't know of anyone who at the moment's been running a licensee who hasn't say, you know what, it's actually pretty straightforward when you've got the right people helping you and doesn't take a huge amount of time or resources. And I also agree with what I've seen is, and I talked about this a little bit with you earlier, if I were to kind of give a description of what the social advisor does overall with advice firms, and it's not just financial advisors, my focus is on advice professions, so accountants and lawyers and coaches and mortgage brokers, etc. But our job is to look at this and take someone who operates in a business, and typically almost all of them are operating, when you look at the true EBIT, of somewhere often less than 30%, and to take them from that to 55%, and then to start to scale that. And so we've had advice firms go well above the 70% EBIT. Now this is really interesting, because once you start getting above 70% EBIT, you're now in technology company, level profitability. But the one thing I will say is, of all of the businesses that we've worked with to go through that evolution and get to the scaling stage and then increase their margins into, post 60%, 65% plus EBIT, The ones that get above that are universally, at least at this point in time, have their own license. And so at a certain point, having control and being able to, really define your own systems, your own process, and control them is you're only going to be able to accomplish, once you actually get to that point of having your own license. So I just kind of wanted to throw that one out there as well.
And that's a really important point, because as the licensee, you are the main person, and it's speed to market with a lot of services as well. Intermediaries want to deal with you directly. You don't have to go and get approval and permission to have, well, you have to go through the processes, but you don't have to get the licensee to sign off if you want to add a new product to your APL. You don't have to get the licensee necessarily to sign off if you want to add a referral partner to your business, and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean as licensee we don't do our DD on those people and maintain registers appropriately, but we can act a lot faster, be a lot nimbler than you would if you're with a dealer group, as an example. And you don't have to use their products because it's your approved product list.
Okay, so look, I think for some people that fact is actually really exciting, but also potentially scary as well, right? So again, this whole brainwashing into the idea of this massive assumption of risk, and so now you're responsible for the products that are on there. And I guess the first thing we would say is, unless you're a good operator and are actually doing things within a pretty decent framework, then having your own license is crazy anyway. Or in fact, I'll just say, if you're looking at bending the rules, or looking at kind of investments that shouldn't be on an APL, then honestly, you shouldn't be operating under anyone's AR. So that all being said, where does the risk really lie in being a practicing financial advisor or financial planner? And we talked about this already. It's not with the AFSL, it's with the authorized representative agreement, right? And we're seeing this now because we've gone through the Royal Commission and the licensees were painting this, well, you've got the backing of a bank-owned, license or whatever. And how much protection is that actually being for people at the moment? Certainly in my experience, not a lot.
No. So I commend everyone to go back to their authorised rep agreement, be it a corporate authorised rep or the individual authorised rep agreement, and you'll find that you're liable as if you were the AFSL licensee, in a nutshell, because they will throw you under the bus as quickly, well, from what we've observed recently, they will throw you out as quickly as they can to maintain what they perceive as their good standing with the regulator. So you're not reducing, in my opinion, your risk by being in a dealer group as an authorised rep. If you're an employee, that's a different situation, because you do have certain privileges and protections as an employee of an organisation. That's another story. So you go back and have a look at what you're liable for as an authorised rep, because you're no more liable within your own licensee. And in talking about the APLs that we were just mentioning, Baz, earlier, I find that people who might have been a little bit left or right or wired out there, all of a sudden become very conservative when it's their own AFSL, not because there's more risk, but it's because, hang on, this is mine and these are my clients and I know what they want. So they frame up their business, they frame up their approved product list, they have products on there to meet their best interest duty that are suitable for their client type. And in fact, they become better businessmen with a better service offering because of these factors. But
now, I'm gonna jump into this for a second, because I don't just want to let this point go past. I think it's really important. We help businesses do amazing things, right? And I can tell you now, it always comes down to the psychology of the people involved. So I can tell you exactly which way to articulate value for which service to a client, and I can give you, the exact guidelines to how to take your organic client referral rate and multiply it by, 10 or 20 or 30 times. But the chance of actually getting someone to just go, wow, that's really good, I'll follow these steps box and do it is very small. Where we actually get the change is by helping them change their perspective. I was actually having a conversation with an advisor today, and we were talking about, some of his client engagements, and I'm saying, hey, look, you don't need more clients. That's not what we're doing. We've got to start with your business model first. See this client, we talked through this whole scenario with the client, and he's thinking about, well, I'm charging this guy, $5,000. I put his fees up to $7,000. That's kind of pushing the friendship. And when I broke it down, I said, no, this is your problem. This is a 30,000 plus a year fee paying client, and you've made this your issue. Because I know if I was sitting in front of this client and I articulated my value and I believed it, they're going to be very happy. By the way, we're talking pretty sophisticated client. And I see these kind of things all of the time. The real breakthrough didn't come from giving a new fee structure. It came from helping this advisor realize how he'd created these hang-ups about what he's doing. So I'm going to bring this in here because changing your environment and moving to your own license changes your context. And when people ask me what I really specialize in, I call it context engineering, helping people change their frame of reference so that everything comes naturally. And there is no doubt within my mind that one of the biggest things that's had a huge negative impact on the financial advice space is the parent-child relation. I know it sounds derogatory, but I've been there. The parent-child relationship between the licensee, the big dealer group, and the practice principal. And this philosophy of we'll take care of it, we'll look after you, we'll support you, don't worry about it, we'll take care of it for you. So this breeding of the reliance factor actually has had a major negative impact across, disruption, thinking differently, developing new ways of delivering advice, and certainly for the advisors themselves taking ownership around how they're running their business. And just changing your mental focus on any of these things, I shouldn't punch the microphone as I'm talking about this, it can make a massive difference. So it does not surprise me in the slightest that what you're saying actually happens. I think there's a huge psychological impetus to that. And I think it's also one of the reasons why I said before that of the really super high level firms that I've worked with, they all have their own license. Once we're getting into that threshold, and I don't think it's just the efficiency and the control, I think it's also the psychology. So I know I kind of went on a bit of a rant there, but it's really, really important stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that you let me kind of do that bit, all right, let's move on. So we talked about how hard it is and how much time and whatever. Well, what about the cost to run ongoing? Like, how expensive is it to run a license from an ongoing point of view? And I know this is one where it's not as easy to go like with the upfront, well, 15 to 20 grand, and it's going to vary depending. But is it by comparison expensive to other options like having a normal, larger dealer group licensee? And at what price or what kind of revenue point can it actually be significantly less expensive potentially to have your own license?
Yeah, they're good questions there, and there's a lot involved in that response. If you're just self-licensed, as in one operator, and you've got a PA and you've got whatever, there is in my opinion, a break-even point. But if there's two or more authorised reps in the current environment with what dealer groups are being forced to put their fees up to cover their costs, their overheads, their monitoring and the supervision, because that's where a lot of the money is going to be going, in the monitoring and supervision obligations that they have to put in place for the masses. People that I'm talking to who are sole operators, they're having their fees bumped up to $30,000, $32,000, $35,000. Well, the ongoing costs, and we talked about variables, really do come into that 35 plus category. And how's that broken down? Ongoing compliance service fees, my assistance, someone else's assistance, is going to be one of the biggest costs. But you've got a professional on board You've got the IP walking in the door, handling all of that for you, and they're contracted. They're not an employee. You don't have to pay their super. They just get on and do their job. And I've got a vested interest because as an RM on a license as well, I have to maintain those organisational competencies and skills to maintain my reputation. So you don't think I'm not going to look after their business? PI insurance. There's a myth out there that PI insurance is one of those, and it can be one of those elephants in the room. But when we've established a new co and it's just got a new AFSL, guess how much risk is in that license? It's zero to start with. So therefore, you come in at base premiums, and depending on the revenue and any previous claims history, and I've been blessed with the folk that we've taken on, typically they've had no, if any, claims in the past. None of my clients that I've got at the moment that I've helped get an AFSL license have had a claims history since the GFC. And those that had a claim history through the GFC was there because they were, in their words, forced into putting clients into products that they wouldn't normally have done. So that's history. So PI insurance, base premiums start off around $7,500, $8,000, and that's for a revenue of around $250,000. So they're the sort of benchmarks, that $250,000, $275,000 that an individual advisor would be looking at, in my opinion. Whether they're earning that or not, they're still going to have the $30,000, $32,000, $35,000 with their current dealer group. And we can show them, depending on the software, the CRM that they may or may not be using, that their cost structure to run their own license on a yearly basis, you've got PI, you've got the AFCA, the EDR, you've got ASIC lodgement fees, you've got ASIC levies, you've got compliance fees, and you bundle all those up, you're going to be in the 30, 35 base price range through 40,000. And then if people are using a particular software product that they have to pay a service subscription to, or they want the bells and whistles with a Morningstar or Lonsec or one other research house providers, those fees can go to mid-40s or higher, but that's dependent on the actual practice themselves. But the thing that folk need to bear in mind, you've got that cost structure whether you've got 1 or 5 representatives operating under you, notwithstanding the ASIC individual advisor fee, which last year was, I think, invoiced out at about $935 per advisor, and it will be similar next year for individual, and we're talking about personal retail advisors, not someone who might be accountant that's providing general advice under your license, as an example. So that's an overview of the cost structure. Errors and omissions included, obviously, Baz, because there are variables depending on the group and who they are. And that's something that people need to consider as the ongoing costs. We discussed earlier some folk that I met late last week, and the father has pulled out, he's relinquished his authority because they wanted to levy $32,000 on him, $32,000 on his son, and $32,000 on the other son. And he said, it's just not feasible, me paying $100,000 in AR fees. So, and he just couldn't get his head around it, that his own AFSL, he would have fixed costs of, we worked out with what they do in their subscriptions, that he would have fixed costs between $45,000 and $48,000 a year. And he kept, but Keith, what about me? What about this? What about the PI? What? $46,000 to $48,000 we had to keep hammering home to the chat. And the son's got it. They're like, Dad, get over it. Come on, let's move on.
It's really interesting. And I kind of like sum up anecdotally my experience in this as well. From the 250,000 of revenue upwards. And of course, it depends in scenarios and what you're paying currently and all the rest of it. But generally speaking, from that point, you're comparable cost-wise. And there might be pluses and minuses. But certainly as a general overview, as the revenue goes up from there, into 500 and then $1 million and then, 1.5 and 2 million, in those scenarios, most of the time, it's significantly more cost effective running your own license. And that includes, as we talked about, having all of the help from someone like yourself.
Yeah, that's
so I think a lot of people will be surprised by that fact. Again, I think a lot of the understanding is it's really risky and it's going to take me a lot more time and be more expensive. And in a lot of cases, that's absolutely not the case at all. and you're getting positive results on all of those aspects. So I think.
Oh, sorry, Baz.
No, you jump in. Go ahead.
Costs are going to come in, and not necessarily to do with running the AFSL license. It's going to be with running their business, the additional back office support staff they might need. Now, notwithstanding, they might put on an additional AR. That additional AR, if they come in without a claims history, aren't going to cost them any more on their PI insurance to have them on there. But their revenue is going to affect their PI insurance, because that's what the underwriter's insuring is the revenue and the risk associated with that.
Yeah, completely understand. I think everyone understands that, especially with your PI insurance, that the more business you're doing, the more risk there is and your premiums go up. So I think with having your own license, it's like any business operation, you're going to have fixed costs and variable costs. And the fixed costs start to scale nicely from that 250,000 of revenue price point. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting to talk about is this idea of multiple parties coming together to run a license. And I see this happen in a range of ways. It might be, 3 or 4 businesses within another license. And I've certainly had conversations with a couple of groups recently within some of those, examples we talked about before where they're having to look elsewhere. And so why don't we come together and set up a licensee between the 4 businesses, and other scenarios, along those lines. Another one, which is I'll set up the license and then I will effectively operate as a small dealer group myself and bring in those firms, and they can pay a fee to us to doing that. So I wanted to talk that through. There is some risk involved in both of those approaches, and I think some key things to think about. So the first one is multiple parties coming together to run a license. What's your thoughts on that?
It can be done, but when I'm sitting down with someone talking to them about that, I advise them, hey, look, have you got the stamina? Because it's going to be like rounding up cats, getting all these guys and girls together. So you need to identify who the leader is in the group that's got the drive and the ambition to run with it, because to get collectively all those chaps together going down the one path is something that I can't do. They have to be able to do that. So that there's that head person who wants to be responsible, because we have, in running the license and in putting the application together, strict timeframes we have to deal with ASIC. They'll come back with a 5-day requisition. They'll start at 10 days, then they'll come in tighter and tighter. And you have to have quick turnarounds. So we need someone who can facilitate and organise, because these folk are all off running their own businesses still and so on and so forth. That's actually the responsible director, for the want of a better term, in the licensee. Doesn't mean the others won't have skin in the game and be directors as well, but a key person is paramount. And the synergies of operating together like that can work out very well, but they also need, obviously, a shareholders agreement and other documentation in place, because there will be departures down the track. I mean, I've had clients die. You have divorces, you have all types of situations, unfortunately, that if you factored that in from the beginning, it's less painful when it arises to deal with it.
Okay, so some really valuable insight there. I would definitely say multi-parties coming together, you need to understand that there has to be an agreement on who is leading and who is responsible, and the fact that it's a bit like, I kind of think the best analogy I can give is, having a university group assignment. And the one diligent person being paired up with 3 or 4 not so diligent parties, and that I've heard plenty of stories around that. Yes, if I remember back to my university days, I'm not going to admit which one of those parties I was. That's just not necessarily a great scenario. Just go into that being aware there needs to be a leader, and you cannot afford to be running a license where the people involved are not actively being managed and having responsibility. So
that leader, Baz, needs to be able to have the authority and the discipline to lead, and his colleagues allow him or her to do that. Not question, well, why did you do this? Why did you do that? In a derogative sense, it's like, well, the information we had on there, I made a captain's court, heaven forbid, use a political type scenario where they made a decision. We give them advice, and we've given some licensees advice, some applicants advice, compliance advice, and they've gone off and they've gone from here to here to here, and it goes around and it comes back in a big circle. It's taken 2 weeks to make a decision. So that's why I was saying this scenario is choose who that's going to be, let them lead, we'll guide and direct them. If they need to revert back to you, dear colleagues, so be it. We will wait until we get directions from that one person. You can't, it's like lawyers, they'll only take instructions typically from one person, and that's their brief. Well, we're the same with the compliance so that we can get the objectives done for them in the compliance arena.
Okay, so I think we've kind of addressed this next kind of query a lot throughout our conversation already. And that is there more risk involved in being self-licensed versus being licensed through a larger dealer group?
Absolutely not. Go and have a look at the authorised rep agreement and what's going on in the industry at the moment. The only difference I would say from my perspective, Baz, is that you don't have the director risk of the licensee when you are an authorised rep. You have the director risk if you're the director of your corporate authorised rep and the guarantees and the obligations that you signed up to with your dealer group. But you may be immune as an authorised rep from some of the other obligations, a regulator, and I was going to say ASIC, but there are other regulators out there that are controlling us. We've got the Tax Practitioners Board, we've got AUSTRAC, we've got the Privacy Act, the Privacy Commissioner, who may have a crack at you where otherwise they wouldn't have in a dealer group, as an example. So, but in terms of your advice and your AR authorised rep risk, they're no different to being in your own AFSL to that of a dealer group.
And in fact, there is certainly some additional potential risk that can also apply to being licensed through someone externally. So let's just kind of unpack this, because if you're going to compare apples to oranges, then you need to kind of frame up, well, what is fruit, right? So let's think about that, because if you're licensed through a larger dealer group, you've got the risk of exactly what started this conversation in the whole point, which is, well, we're not doing that anymore. You've got a couple of months to find a new home. You also have the very real risk of, and in fact, this is a major, major concern, and I think this is actually what will trigger a pretty large wholesale shift, I believe, I'm calling it now, from being a part of a larger license to considering self-license. And that is, as ASIC has come through and re-looked at things through the post-Royal Commission and the fee for no service. I'm still not ready to use ASIC's acronym for that one yet. Is that the larger groups are applying a lower common denominator handling scenario, resolution scenario, and business model. And that means way significantly more complexity for the individual AR to try and live their business life in that environment. And
they have to work and live around the lowest common denominator that the dealer group dictates for the lowest common denominator. And we've all got words that we probably can't say in the public domain for those lowest common denominators that are within the dealer groups. So in your own AFSL license, within the law, within the regulatory guides, various regulations, you can tailor your operations as long as you can demonstrate that you are meeting those requirements. They can be tailored down for, look, this is how we do business, as long as you have a policy and procedure that's compliant. We do it this way for these reasons. One example we talked about, if you like to have a 15-page SOA that's meaningful, you can do that in your own AFSL license, because that is all that's required. An SOA is a disclosure document. It's clear and concise. It's not this 30, 40, 50, 60-page document that the dealer groups say that you have to have. Now, that doesn't mean you don't meet the best interest duty over in your client files as well as your SOA. But at the end of the day, if you want a clear, concise and effective document, you're the licensee, you can design and do that. And we show people different legal precedents that are available that achieve those results that are workable, practical solutions, and they're cost effective. And that goes
Yeah, look, I think you maybe just grabbed a couple of people's attention there, right? You know, in other words, whilst things are getting far more complex in operating through an external dealer group and also more expensive, I'm hearing stories every day of price increases, and of course that's going to be the case. I mean, when their life is more complex and it's harder for them to cater to this, what's the lowest common denominator risk in ASIC's new policies, then cost is going to have to increase. And so, in other words, I think people need to understand that in many cases, there may actually be more risk involved in being licensed through a larger dealer group other than having your own, just through all of those opportunity cost aspects as well.
And clients aren't silly. They pick up on these things of, why are you doing all of this? We don't read it anyhow, typical catchphrase. And it's like, when you're out on your own, it's like, well, it's a good news story. We have our own AFSL license. I've never seen a client who's rejected, so, oh, I really want you to be with a bank or a dealer group. Now, what's going on? When you're your own AFSL licensee and they can see that, well, this is ours, we're acting in your best interest, we're doing this, we're clean, we're mean, we're efficient. We're not mean, but we're efficient in what we do and how we deliver it. Clients adapt to that. They embrace it and they refer their friends through to your business as well, because you're self-licensed and you've tailored everything around your clients, what's right and appropriate for how you do business. And it is a good news story, and it's mitigating a lot of risk, actually being your own licensee in the deliverables of your service and being able to demonstrate to ASIC how this is fit for purpose, it is right and proper, and we are acting obviously within the law in doing it this way. Now, if you're dumb and you blow up somehow, you steal client money, you do something criminal illegal, well, yeah, you should be in jail. And I hope the regulator goes after you and the courts do as well. The regulator
I can definitely agree with that. And so, and as I think everyone listening to this will agree with that as well.
Yeah, yeah. And then there's the others who we unfortunately often get pulled down, caught up in all of this nonsense that goes on with. And it's the old, well, it's not even 80-20 rule. It's probably 99-1% rule.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's a very small percentage. I mean, I'm connected to more than 10,000 advisors myself on LinkedIn just through that one element. And I actually know who they are and have met them at events or conferences or had conversations or whatever. And having been and living in this environment for a long time, I can spot it from a mile away. I'd agree with you. It's a pretty low percentage. And yes, they can do a whole lot of damage. I also think there's been, and this is where the banks got in some trouble, especially with, they're more aligned and tied. I think there's maybe been a bit more of a focus on product, and that's maybe taken people astray. And I think that's really important. Advice is going to go through a huge evolution, one that makes it more responsible, that has more of a focus on charging, fees for value, not even for service. I'm kind of, fee for service is outdated itself. It's fee for value. And having your own license actually allows you to be far more commercial in how you look at the business risk that you're taking when you're not really taking any, as most good advisors I know, they're not. They run with a pretty straightforward AFSL. They don't do extreme levels of gearing, if a lot at all, right? They're going with pretty conservative scenarios, and the value they're giving to their clients comes through the advice and the planning and the structuring and the risk mitigation and actually talking to them about their lives. And so when you're doing that, you're not really pushing the boundaries of risk. You're delivering not only a service, but value. And so I think that, as I said, I believe that the trend for this will continue. And I think what's happened through the Royal Commission will certainly lead to that pathway as well. Now, all of that painting rosy pictures so far, pretty much. So now we're going to get onto
another rosy picture on there where you.
Yeah, please jump ahead before we get into the. Well, hang on a second. What's the stuff you should take into account and who should be doing this? So go ahead.
Well, the thing to take into account in terms of the advice that we've just discussed here when you're self-licensed, and this is where the fee for service is paramount, because the direction the industry has moved, a lot of my clients look after the affairs like a family office of their clients. They're high net worth individuals, they're SMSFs and so on and so forth. But they're also taking advantage of, because they're self-licensed, being able to provide advice to clients that's not a financial product. Therefore, they don't have to do a statement of advice. They would be prudent, and they are prudent in providing an advice paper and disclosing conflicts of interest and remuneration paid and received, which are ACCC requirements, but they don't have to put that advice and strategy into an SOA, only if a financial product is involved. By way of example, try and do that in a dealer group.
Yeah, I was going to say, in fact, this is an area that I've really been working on with firms, and I think it's really important. Advisors don't take advantage of being able to solve a much bigger, a broader range of client problems, and they're also not charging for it. So this is what I said by, when we work with businesses, a lot of the time they come to me because we're known for helping businesses grow, social media, attract new clients, increase referrals, all of that. Absolutely, I love, but there's no point doing that unless you really have got your business model working in the right way. And a big part of that is how much value you're actually giving to the existing clients you've got. Why would you bother going and getting a new client when you can increase your revenue by 50% just by going deeper and adding more value to clients? And I think that's really, really important. I think the trend for non-regulated advice will continue, and it's something I've been talking about passionately for 15 years. Don't put yourself in this product box. You also almost need to just understand you have to be compliant. If you are working in that broader ecosystem, it forms part of your discipline, right? Or I call it the advice denomination. So if you're an accountant or a financial advisor, you're just an advisor to me. It just happens to be that you've got a slightly different denomination in the same religion, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, the same thing applies if you're an accountant. You've obviously got to make sure your compliance is taken care of and, you have all of that sorted. So, all right, that's really cool. I think, as I said, we've painted a pretty rosy picture here, but it's not for everyone.
Oh, absolutely not.
And it's not just a price point, because the thing about having your own license is that you have to do certain things in a certain way and make sure they're done efficiently. And if you're not at a point where you're naturally the person who does that, or your business isn't quite at that stage, then it's probably not going to be worthwhile you making that change. So let's kind of talk about what that actually means. Who is it not right for, in your opinion?
Well, you and I, Baz, can probably meet someone and talk to them, and within 5 to 10 minutes know and understand that, it's just not going to work for this guy or girl. And some people, I've always said, should stay with the bank. They're great employees. They're going to be fantastic at what they do and have a terrific career there. Others, need to be out and be authorised reps of a licensee or with a self-licensed person. And then there's others who need to go and get their own AFSL because they just should have done it years ago. Once they've got it, they realise it. They need to be people, in my opinion, who are self-driven, self-directed. Life's not getting in their way at this point in time. And if you haven't, we all will go through life events that can be sometimes devastating. There can be a loss in the family. There can be a divorce. Or the kids are just all over us at the moment. We haven't got time to think of anything else. So they need to stay an employee, by way of example. It's not for you or me, certainly not for me, Baz, to put a label on them whether they could or they couldn't. But these are the things I think if they go to the core of it and know thyself, they will understand that, I'm ready for this, or hang on, I need to get to this level. I need this bit of coaching. I need to do that before I'm ready to do this. Or hell's bells, why didn't we do this 2 years ago?
So let's delve into that. And I kind of want to maybe use a couple of examples to help people understand the practical, application of some of the things we're talking about. So, you mentioned it. If you're running your own, self-licensed business, then you have an obligation to actually pay your creditors within certain guidelines. And so if you're not really on the ball with your books and your payment of bills and your efficiency and your cash flow management and those things, that can have an impact on your license. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, so as an AFSL licensee, there's a license condition that reads similar to this: be able to pay your debts as and when they fall due. And when you overlay that in the context of RG 166, the financial requirements and the forward cash flow requirements, what that means in reality is if someone writes you an invoice due and payable on the 15th of May, you need to pay it on the before or on the 15th of May, preferably before. Your accountant will be looking out for it, but specifically your AFSL financial auditor, not to be confused with a advice auditor, financial auditor will be looking out that you've paid your debts as and when they've fallen due. So if you have problems paying the bills, maybe not for you. If you have problems with cash flow, or you've got a big debt coming up or a separation, those sort of things, you need to get your financial house in order, because you have this ongoing obligation as an AFSL licensee, is if you don't meet it, you'll be suspended, you'll be banned, you'll be out of the game before you know it, in terms of not being able to pay your debts as and when they fall due. There's numerous other matters that people need to consider, whether it's right for them or not. We've alluded to some of those, and often people team up with a different personality type. They're good at doing this, this, and this, and I'm good at doing that, that, and that. And together, collectively, the 2-3 business partners, not that I'm suggesting they should form a partnership as such, structure-wise, but together they bring synergies to the business that's empowering and gives them growth like they wouldn't believe, especially when they've got their own AFSL, because they just gain so much traction. As you can see, I'm a big believer of being self-licensed.
Yeah, well, I think that's obvious. And we did make the statement up front that you are a bit of a compliance nerd. And by the way, that's okay, because
That's a compliment.
Yeah, absolutely. And the compliance nerd will take that as an absolute compliment. And by the way, I think it is. So I'm kind of going to delve into this with some context and perspective of my own. And that is to say that a lot of businesses that I encounter, and maybe less so for you, because maybe they're coming to you when they've already passed this threshold. A lot of advice businesses, and I mean the majority, are not actually really profitable. And the reason they're not profitable is there's a whole bunch of things in there. They've set up their business. Okay, it might be profitable to a point, but really they've just bought themselves a new salary. And the reason for that is because they haven't got their value articulation right. They haven't put systems in place, or the right systems. But most importantly, they're not really getting their clients to buy in, and they're not charging them appropriately. So I kind of won't go into all the ways that advisors undercharge, but most of them have no idea how much they're doing this within their businesses. And so if you're in that scenario, that can mean that cash flow can be tight to balance. You still actually might be making money, and you're going ahead, and you're still growing, and you're still doing all of those things. But if you haven't got that nailed down, then like we were talking about before, you probably want to get that stuff sorted, so that you're at the point where, you've got reserves set aside for when, your BAS and your tax and all of that's due, that you're paying your creditors. And by the way, we do work for lots of organizations. And if we're talking about whether banks should have a license based on whether they pay their creditors, I've worked for a lot of them. Let's just say that they may be the worst on turnaround times for invoicing. But anyway, we aren't going to delve into that. And we certainly won't mention names on that either. So my point is that you have to consider this from where is your business staging at, right? So if you're in that position, even if you're a sole operator, if you are the kind of person who is diligent, they're on top of things, you get things done on time when they need to be done, even if you're a sole operator, then having your own license can work absolutely great. Alternatively, and let's talk about personality profiles, and I'll actually dob myself in here. I have tendencies towards one of the more common advice profiles, and that is I'm great speaking to people, I'm great at coming up with systems, I'm pretty good at leading a team, I'm not so good at managing a team, And so the closing the loop element isn't my strong point. That's actually why I'm in business for myself. So I could hire people to do those things. I'd be a terrible employee for that reason. And because of that, if I didn't have the right people in my team, because of whatever stage I was at, to make sure those things happened, I would not be suitable as a candidate to have my own license. So it's either based on your financial scenario, right? So you're at a point where you can manage all of that, your personality profile, so you just make sure things happen anyway, or you've built yourself to a point where the business can take care of that on your behalf, which is, how I would go about doing things, making sure I've got the right people so that I can make sure that everything's paid when it needs to be done, everything's lodged, etc. Does that kind of fit with your thinking?
Because if they come to us with their house in order, it's so much easier. Otherwise, you're spot on, Baz. They've got to get all those personal and business, not all of them. We're never ever going to reach the end of it. I mean, I have consultants consult to me and advise me on my business and where we should be going. I have huge legal bills on getting advice to upskill myself, my IP, by way of example. It's an ongoing process, but if they haven't got to a level where they can put their hand on the heart and say, yeah, I'm ready to do this, rather I want to do this, or worse still, they're forced into it because the dealer group, I know of people out there who have to find a new licensee and no one else wants to take them on. But they're not suitable for even me to engage, as in I won't engage with them either, because it's just a disaster waiting to happen, unfortunately, for some of them. So I feel sorry for them, but that's not a situation of my making. They need to go out and engage with people like yourself and others to get this together so that they can make it happen.
Well, I'm just thinking about a lot of businesses that I work with who they're great advisors. They've got good revenue, they've got great team members, but they're struggling and costs are going up, complexity is going up, and all of a sudden, the bit that they thought they were doing well on, it's all kind of starting to shake loose. Yeah. And certainly in those cases, even though I think they're very suitable to be self-licensed, I'd be saying to them, this isn't the way you should go right now. We need to do these things and get to this point before that's the next step.
Yeah, no, that's a fair call.
So I think that's probably given people a very good overview of what it takes to run your own license, when you should think about it, what the costs and obligations are, and who it is and isn't appropriate for. And certainly for people in that scenario, I've had many conversations along the lines of, why did I not do this sooner? It's just been amazing. And for the right people, I think that's definitely something that they should be considering. So look, I want to kind of wrap up there. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we kind of do our closing remarks for everyone?
No, well, I've enjoyed this discussion. I'm sure there's going to be copious questions come to you regarding it. And maybe we do it again sometime in the future around a different set of questions that might arise to do with my specialty, which is AFSL licensing and the ongoing compliance of those licenses, Baz.
So I'd encourage everyone to make sure they jump in the comments wherever they're consuming this, and to give us their thoughts as well as ask questions. And then that way Keith and I can continue developing ways to come back and answer that for everyone as well. Look, don't forget you can connect to Keith on LinkedIn, or you can shoot him an email if you want to hit him up about any of the stuff that we've talked about today. So remember, that will be in the notes wherever you're tuning in for this. The only thing, or the only caveat that I would add to that is Keith's about to go on holidays for 3 weeks, so he may be a little slow in replying to you in detail during that time, and I don't want him to be swamped when he's supposed to be having fun with his wife overseas. So, mate, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you so much for your time and your pursuit of giving value to people. It's certainly been evident for me today. I think you're a great bloke, and I can't believe we hadn't met before and had a chance to chat. So looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks very much, Keith.
All the best. Thank you.